The second panel of this conference is really focused on the European Union and the sort of internal aspects of how the EU gets involved in foreign and security policy. And so what we're going to do is go in the order of the programs. First we're going to hear from Mai'a Davis-Cross from Northeastern University, and then from Chantal Lavallee from the University of Montreal. And then we have Pat McDonald from our own UT Department of Government to give some comments, as well as Bert Versmessen, who works in the European External Action Service. So I'm sure he'll have a lot of things to say about these papers as well. So we're going to go in that order. So I'm going to hand it over to Mai'a. Okay. And each of you has about 15 minutes to talk, and I'll give you a little warning for 5 minutes and 2 minutes if that works.
That's perfect, yes. Thank you. It's really great to be here. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. This paper is still a work in progress, so it's a bit on the shorter side, and I'm really looking forward to feedback and comments so I can fill it out and especially advance with the case studies. But generally I do work in this area of EU foreign and security policy, and I guess just to kind of characterize my approach, I think that I am very much in agreement with my colleagues who are going to be part of this special issue, that the EU is a really important and emerging security actor. It's still relatively new. The CFSP and especially CSDP are very new. But it is emerging as an actor in its own right. Although we're talking about it as a kind of catalyst, I think it is actually also an autonomous actor that's growing in importance. And the reason for this is that much of the time it does actually speak with one voice when it comes to various foreign policy issues. Now we can, of course, easily point to major junctures in which coming together and trying to speak with one voice fails, like Iraq 2003 and more recently Libya 2011. But these are more kind of the more visible things that are covered a lot in the media. In general, I think it's a mistake to draw conclusions just from these events alone. In general, on a day-to-day basis, the EU is a pretty strong foreign policy actor. Finally, I would just mention that I'm also in agreement with my colleagues, and write about this often, that security is a much broader concept than just boots on the ground. It includes many things like the internal and external dimension that the EU deals with regularly. So that's kind of the way I approach this. And then in this specific paper, in support of the kind of main theme put forward by the co-editors, I am arguing that the EU is really well positioned, and in particular the European External Action Service is well positioned to serve as a catalyst, specifically in the way they talk about crafting an institutional arena and ideational space for the creation of all kinds of linkages in the security area. So it has this holistic, it has this catalytic role, but at the same time it has not, the European External Action Service in particular, has not reached its peak in terms of its functioning. It's very new. It does, I think, fall short of preferred outcomes, and I'll get into that. But I think it is ideally kind of situated and designed for this. So I'm going to just briefly talk about how I see the European External Action Service as a kind of good example of the use of smart power. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about 3 case studies that I address in the paper, how the EEAS has done in action, so to speak, in dealing with the recent counterterrorism threat with the Charlie Hebdo massacre. Secondly, in dealing with Iran and its desire to develop nuclear weapons. And third, the recent Russia-Ukraine crisis. So those are the examples that I chose. So first, thinking about the European External Action Service, I might just say EEAS going forward, and smart power. As you know, on December 1st, 2010, the EEAS was launched. And it was done so rather inconspicuously. Most of the world didn't really sit up and pay attention and realize that this had actually happened. But I think it does represent a major innovation in the field of diplomacy. It's the first supranational diplomatic service of its kind. It shows that over the long term, Europeans have this big picture desire to have an ambitious new multinational approach to diplomacy. and that they take smart power seriously. At least on the symbolic level, this is what this means. So I think this does bode well, since we're still early on, for the EU as a CFSP actor in its own right, as well as a catalyst. So we could point to sort of 3 reasons why the EEAS is a kind of a big step forward and representative of smart power. First, I would say that the powers of these new EU delegations are significantly broader and more ambitious than the previous Commission delegations. Secondly, the EEAS now has a clear mandate to coordinate, shape, and enact the entire body of EU foreign policy, specifically under the command, the much more centralized command of the EU foreign policy chief. So in this sense, rather than just being a kind of offshoot of one EU institution, as it was more or less before, it, I think, has become an embodiment of EU foreign policy, and it's in the process of trying to cultivate a specific diplomatic identity or institutional identity. These things, of course, take time. Third, this common security and defense policy is embedded within the EEAS, as I see it, and this is another important aspect of smart power. If we look at the 2013 review of the EEAS, it called for even closer and better integration of the CSDP within the EEAS. It actually said, quote, "It should be more than a foreign ministry, it should combine elements of a development and of a defense ministry," unquote. So it was explicit about this. So how does this all augment the EU's smart power? I had defined smart power briefly in my question to the earlier panel, but it's generally regarded as the effective combination of both hard power, meaning coercion, and soft power, meaning co-option or attractive power. So I think smart power, I do see it as central to the comprehensive approach and central to this catalytic role. The EEAS essentially enables better coordination of the soft and hard power side, because traditionally the member states kind of have this mandate and capability and legitimacy to exercise hard power, and the EU tends to lean more on the soft power side. Using hard power, using coercion for the EU kind of goes against its normative character. It will do that, it will do this, but it sees it as a last resort. And I'm not being critical in saying this. I actually think that, you know, the EU, if you can kind of clump the whole actor together, EU institutions, actually want to be seen more as an attractive power rather than a coercive power. So the EEAS allows the better coordination of what the member states bring to the table and what the EU institutions bring to the table. And secondly, the EEAS, besides coordinating, also amplifies the smart power that the EU sort of has at its disposal. It's often repeated. Member states wish to speak with one voice. We know that even Eurobarometer opinion polls show that EU citizens would like a stronger common foreign and security policy, a stronger EU defense. And so this is what the EEAS does. Its function is to amplify this capability. And to do that, of course, it has to bring together divergent member states' positions. But again, you know, while I say it's ideally suited to do this, we have to then look at how does it do this in action in terms of achieving preferred outcomes. So I'm now moving to the second bit, which is to look at the 3 case studies that I started to examine. So, as you know, the EEAS is dealing with CFSP and CSDP. It's trying to promote a comprehensive approach. It's also trying to be visible in its actions, right? It has a public diplomacy function as well. It wants to be visible. In order to be a diplomatic actor, you have to be seen on the world stage. And so in my case studies, I do sort of emphasize the role of the HRVP in this, Ashton and then now Mogherini. So I said I have the 3 case studies. The first one, counterterrorism, second, Iran, and third, Russia, Ukraine. So looking at the first one, counterterrorism, even before these recent Charlie Hebdo attacks and other terrorist attacks throughout Europe, uncovering sleeper cells and so on, the EEAS was strengthened in this area. Specifically, I would say because the Intelligence Center was brought into the umbrella of the European External Action Service. So this allowed much more of a quick and direct interaction between the HRVP and the intelligence capability. But since those attacks, the EEAS has, I think, responded as a kind of catalyst to doing more, to creating various policy linkages in dealing with terrorism. Of course, as you know, the EU and its member states deal with terrorism more as an internal kind of challenge and issue, as opposed to the US, which looks at it more as foreign policy. But there is a recognition that there's an external dimension for the EEAS to play in this. So the current HRVP Mogherini said, quote, "I have said many times since the attack on Charlie Hebdo that there must be no divide between what the EU does internally and what we do externally when it comes to our security." So in saying this, I think she consciously broadens the ideational space for conceiving of counterterrorism in line with the purpose of this kind of special issue. This allows the EEAS to play a catalytic role. It allows coordination with third countries with the explicit goal of creating cohesion and efficiency in doing this. Now, this is all terribly new. So it's, at this point, more about sort of taking action and putting things into place for the future. But Mogherini specifically calls for the revamping of the EU's counterterrorism policy, and with an emphasis on sharing intelligence, sharing information. So one of the things that's been debated is this passenger name record initiative that the US follows. Currently, 16 EU member states do it on a national level. But the question is, can this become an EU level policy? If it does, it will be a source of hard power, because it would allow the EU, Europol, Interpol to basically take action to track people who are traveling and so on. On the soft power side, Mogherini has instituted this thing through the EEAS delegations, which involve deploying security specialists to the delegations around the world, specifically though focused on the Middle East, Gulf region, and North Africa, to create a so-called anti-terror alliance. This would involve more people knowing Arabic, cultural exchanges, working partnerships, and so on through this kind of global anti-terror network. The second case, Iran, there's this E3 and EU +3 negotiations where the EU takes the lead. So the EU has had a relationship with Iran since 1998, and in 2005 it was discovered that Iran was working on building nuclear weapons capabilities. So you have several rounds of binding sanctions and intensive talks with the EU taking the lead. Specifically involving Ashton, the first HRVP, who continues on in this role. So the EU finally expands sanctions, but with the new elections in Iran in June 2013, there was this view that there's a new opportunity now to do more. So in January 2014, they agreed this joint action plan, which is the first step towards hopefully a long-term settlement. So here again, you see the diplomatic role of the EEAS, and other tools for power that are more on the hard power side, involving import-export bans, sanctions, and so on. And then also a policy linkage to the human rights issues. So the EEAS really serves as a catalyst to bring in the UN and the IAEA in trying to do this bridge building on the diplomacy side. So finally, on the case of Russia and its incursion into Ukraine, the EU also has had a long-term relationship with Russia since 1994, based on all kinds of multidimensional shared interests. Ever since the illegal actions into Crimea, the EEAS has had the strategy of gradually ratcheting up the restrictive measures on Russia with rounds of sanctions, coordinating with the US, and serving as a catalyst to bring other countries into this sanction kind of coalition. This includes Australia, Canada, Japan, Norway, and Switzerland. I think it's a really great example as well of a smart power strategy. The EU is able to speak with one voice. And it is widely believed, and Mogherini has said this, that if the EU couldn't hold together on this issue of Russia, the whole coalition might have collapsed. In fact, Putin himself was surprised that they did manage to speak with one voice on the sanctions issue, because he had kind of counted on separating out EU member states. Sanctions aren't the only tool. We also have the through NATO, the Rapid Reaction Force of 5,000 troops stationed in EU countries, as well as 30,000 NATO troops added in a rolling basis in bases across EU member states. So even though this is through NATO, it's all involving EU member states. And then on the soft power side, of course, it's more targeted at Ukraine. The rapid kind of trying to bring forward the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, a CSDP advisory mission, using the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the World Bank and IMF to provide assistance to Ukraine. So again, the EU, like the structure of this special issue implies, is kind of at the middle of a bunch of institutions, but also really a fulcrum for enabling these foreign policy issues to take place. So just to conclude, I think that member states created this EEAS to really help the EU's foreign and security policy to become coherent. It's still at its early stage, and I think it is on track to not just be a bureaucratic structure, but to really embody CFSP. But it is still important to point out that, you know, are we really getting to preferred outcomes? We can say there is an extent to which the EEAS is a catalyst and enabling the EU to be a CFSP actor. But the preferred outcome aspect of it is still kind of a big question mark, especially in these three cases. We have a counterterrorism policy, but with thousands of foreign fighters returning to Europe, it's questionable whether, you know, this can actually, the counterterrorism strategy is enough. And the same is true with Iran and Russia, whether these restrictive measures will work. The EU may be a catalyst, but are we going to get a solution that makes things more secure in the end? So I think I'll stop with that and just note that, you know, hopefully this, I'd like to hear what you think about the connection between smart power and sort of how the framework chapter is shaping up and whether that's useful or not. And then also sort of the question of how to assess actions and the EU's role and whether that connects to the preferred outcomes in the end. But thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so now we're going to hear from Chantal Lavallee, who's going to go even deeper into the bureaucracy of the EAS by talking about the way that it deals with crisis management. You can just press escape, it's a PowerPoint. Yeah, you can just close that.
Great. So, good morning everyone. Again, I just want to join my colleague to say thank you so much to Michael and Laurie to have organized this event, to have made it possible, to have initiated this great collaboration, and of course also to Sally, if she's there, for all this administrative organization, which is so useful. So, as Laurie just said, in my case, so my contribution to the special issues is to look about the impact of the recent development of this EU crisis response system on the role of the EU, on the contribution of the EU and the European security area. And so what I'm interested in is to to better understand how the EU has positioned itself in this European foreign and security policy architecture with this new crisis response system, how the system works, and what are the effects on this organizational cooperation at the regional security. And so mainly the argument of the paper is to say that with the EU crisis response system as for sure consolidate the EU role as a catalyst and the European security. But this position is still based on a fragile balance. That's what I will quickly present in my presentation, that there is internal but also external challenge that the EU face, and that it should be taken into account to better understand what kind of catalyst the EU can be in European security. I will pass quickly, but I thought it's important to make a few remarks on the EU comprehensive approach. Already my colleague mentioned it in a different way, but in the logic of my presentation, of course I come back to this European security strategy in 2003, so it's the time for an update, but it's still the reference and the key reference. And what is interesting is I will point out three elements. is this comprehensive approach to security, so that the EU really link the security and development, also try to strengthen the civil and the military synergy, because that they are often together involved in the crisis. So also the civilian aspect should be taken into account and better managed with the military aspect. And also the merging of internal and external aspect of security. So that's give, of course, a broader definition to what is security and how the EU approach it. So that's one point. Another key point that was already mentioned in this comprehensive approach is that the EU really pushed forward this to strengthen this effective mutual system, so to really strengthen the cooperation with the different partners at the international but also the regional level. And then the third point mentioned, there's many things in this open security strategy, but one key element is, of course, to underline the added value of the EU to have at its disposal a wide range of instruments which can be mixed to better answer the crisis, to respond to the multifaceted situation, and so that's explain why the EU can really act as a catalyst in this field. What also this tells us is that if we enlarge the definition of security at the EU level, and that the EU can use different tools, that involves also more actors at the EU levels, so that we have seen this emergence of the EU security governance with different actors, also from the Commission, and so different structures are involved and the comprehensive action at some point. And also if we include also all the partnership that the EU have developed, so to strengthen this effective mutual system, that also involve the EU in a broader security governance. And that's what I will talk in the coming minutes, so to explain the different challenges the EU is facing and putting into practice this EU comprehensive approach. So to pass from the theory to the practice, that's the main question underlined by my paper, is that's good to say that the EU had this capability to mobilize different instruments, but then I better want to ask the capacity to mobilize all those instruments, because it's one thing to have those instruments, but what is the EU capacity to really mobilize in an efficient way? To come back to the discussion of this morning about how the EU can really manage the use of those different tools on the ground. And that's come to my approach to see the EU as a real structures of power, where there is of course different actors now involved, if we keep this idea of a comprehensive approach to security. And of course those actors have some interest, some capacity, and different interests to push forward their own role and their own instruments and the EU response. And so that's one thing we should keep in mind, and that's why my interest in the paper is to look the relations between those actors, the struggle of force, and the interest of the different actors to push forward their own position. And in this sense, the crisis response system is a really good, can be a really good mechanism, because as the system is really present as this missing structure of coordination, so the structures who should be able to translate this EU comprehensive approach to a EU comprehensive action response on the ground look really promising, and it's what I want to evaluate in the paper, to see how far can go the structures, how far the structure can be really this coordination structure I need by the EU to act on the ground. So that brings me to my second point. So if we look more in detail about how this crisis response system works, first of all we should see where it's located. I know it's really small, but it's the idea to show you that so this crisis response system has been placed inside this department, the Crisis Response and Operational Coordination Department, which is located so here, those structures here, which are so directly linked to the High Representative. And I cannot go so much in detail, so if you have questions afterwards, I would be really happy to go more in details about how it was developed and implement. But quickly to say that, of course, the idea came only afterwards of the Haiti earthquake, and the idea of Catherine Ashton to create this missing crisis response to better equip the EU to respond quickly to a emergency situation. But also with the time the definition get a bit broader, so it's about, yes, disaster and natural, but and man disaster, and also we talk about political and armed conflict consequences to manage, so it can be quite broad. We talk about external action outside the EU, but also internal inside the EU if there is external implication. So it's a real crisis response system in a broader way. And so I will stop here to mention that this system includes 3 divisions, but I will focus for the purpose of the presentation on the main division. The first one is the crisis response planning and operation, and that brings me to the first main challenge of the EU, because this division is so to bring around the table all the key EU actors from the Commission, from the different geographic department in the External Action Service, from also the key structures linked to the CSDP structures, to bring everyone around the table to discuss, to see which tool and all those tools can be used together to make so this comprehensive approach into a real and hopefully efficient comprehensive action. So that's what's put in place to make it possible and to try to bring a strategic direction inside the External Action Service and also toward the Commission and the idea to EU action on the ground. So again, in the discussion we can also come back to here. For the moment it was to present you at least this first, oh, I forget one thing, of course. One thing just to mention it quickly, that is of course, as you can see, is the crisis platform. So that's the main, the key element of this crisis response planning and operation is this capacity to, on an ad hoc basis, to create those crisis platforms, so to bring all those actors together. And already for several crises, this crisis platform have been held. So for the crisis to respond to the crisis in Horn of Africa and the Sahel and Congo and Libya. So that's the form which take place to at the EU level to respond to the crisis. Then I come to this other division, which is the EU situation room, because to be able to better response to crisis, of course the information is at the center of is first the coordination, but also is linked to the information on which the EU can base its action. So the EU situation room aim to bring to work on the floor the information between the EU crisis platform and of course this situation room, but also with all the partner, third country, but international and regional organization, and all based on already partnership developed with UN and NATO. As this morning we already talked a lot about NATO, and the paper is the interest to underline the cooperation with the regional organization in the field of early warning mechanism, early warning response. And it's interesting to underline that in the last year, the EU have developed close cooperation with, for instance, the League of Arab States to support the League and establishment of a crisis room. So, and the support is at several levels, financially, at the technological level, but also for the training and for advices, and of course at the end of the day is also to strengthen the cooperation. And the EU even precise that the idea is to support a pan-Arab and even pan-African, because the cooperation is also there with the African Union. So to develop in Asia as well and the Arab world and Africa, an early warning system which can be useful to react to crisis directly on the ground, but then also be supported by the EU, and those broad cooperation already developed. So that's the two main divisions of this system, on which, as I said, I can come back with more details in the discussion. Now I will arrive to the key point of my analysis is to say, so yes, with this system, the EU have a better tool to act as a catalyst, and so to strengthen the relation with the actor inside the EU, but also with the partner. But of course, the EU is facing many challenges. I will start with the internal challenges. First of all, if we talk about a legal term, the EU crisis response system encountered quickly some reluctant resistance inside the EU system. If you remember the structure of the EAS that I show, the structure is somehow on the top, but there is no really legal authority gave to this department to act as this coordinator, as this to have the authority to be the coordinator inside the EAS, which is already problematic, but also on the Commission. And we have seen the Commission create its own mechanisms and also its own coordination structures to avoid to be too much coordinated by the outside. And so just the question authority the authority have been questioned for legal purpose, because also it's not clear how far the department who manage the EU crisis response, how far these structures can go, and so I will step here. And the other main challenges, though, beyond this legal and share of responsibility and authorities, is the common understanding of what is a crisis. So to develop a crisis response culture. And as the director of the department, Agostino Amuso, I've often said in different fora that it was his main challenge from the beginning to develop this crisis response culture, and more or less a kind of one ministry where is more not necessarily on reaction to crisis, but more in a long-term perspective to develop position. So this idea to develop a common and a shared perception of the crisis is also a challenge. And so there is still the need to overcome the different organizational culture, but also institutional prerogative inside the EU. So the challenges are still remaining. And as I just learned that Agostino Amuso, I've seen his position not renew. So let's see what will happen internally, who will go this coordination structure, if it will remain like this, or if another structure will take the follow-up. If I go quickly on the external challenges, so the idea for the EU to support other structures, and as I said in my paper, I focus more on the regional organization as African Union, League of Arab States, the ASEAN. So the idea to support the development of other crisis rooms is quite interesting and promising, and can be this new access for the EU to be to really take position as a catalyst in the European security, to bring this new access inside this broad cooperation. But as we have seen so far, is that of course all those new crisis rooms around the globe don't share necessarily the same goal, don't have the same budget, the same mean, the same technology or strategy and approach, and that already brings a challenge for the EU to be really able to push them to go forward. And also there is different emphasis put on those crisis rooms so far, different hues, and it remains to be seen how this new network of crisis rooms can really support this EU international role. And everything is of course always built on trust, so it's the idea that trust should be of course created and put in place before that the crisis happens. So it's a long-term process, a long-term cooperation, and that's need time to develop this cooperation, this coordination reflex. So it's really part of a long process, and we are still at the early stage. And we talk about this, the EU crisis response system was more or less launched in 2011, and all those new cooperation is relatively new, so it remains to be seen how deep this link can be developed. So just quickly to conclude, we have seen that the EU crisis response system can be this coordination structures needed by the EU to be able to translate this comprehensive approach into comprehensive action. But there are several challenges internally and externally that indeed the EU is in a really strategic position, but to play as a real catalyst, those challenges should be taken into consideration, and that we should not forget that the EU, as with we always spoke about, EU is not an homogeneous actor, is indeed the structures of power, but including several structures of power. If we talk about the External Action Service, is far to be an homogeneous actor, and the same for the European Commission with between the different DG. So that also should be taken into account when we think about one unique structure of coordination. It should be really important to think about where we will put this structure of coordination. And then the EU should cope with this difference of perception and use of crisis room and the new cooperation and early warning system. So that also should be managed, and the EU should also see how to strengthen the cooperation in those domains. But at some point, there is also a part that the EU cannot really control, as is all the partner will use this. And just to finish, as Mai'a said that when I present my paper in the ISA, how far the EU want to go to be to rely on information from the partner, or to still count on his own source of information when arrives the time to respond to crisis. So I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
All right, so we're going to go to Pat next. So Pat McDonald from UT Government is going to give us some comments on these two papers, and I'll just
okay. All right,
hand
thanks.
it over to you. If you can come up here or stay there, however, whatever's more.
Is it okay if I stay here?
It's fine. By me.
I promise to talk loud. So I'm going to have some common comments across both papers, and then I'll take each one in the order that they were presented. And first of all, I should, my sense of, or give you my biases first. So I'm kind of a traditional IR security studies scholar who still sees a world of states. And so my baseline is often, as I read these papers, I'm thinking about what's an alternative theory, and not necessarily does that have to be, I wouldn't necessarily say incorporate that in the papers, and that's really something for the editors to decide, but it's going to shape what types of empirical evidence I'm looking for. And so my alternative framework, I'm thinking, all right, so what's a basic state-centered alternative explanation here, and can we provide some evidence that it's not just state and national interests that are driving key responses. So the second thing that I want to suggest in terms of, is there an alternative theory that's at work here? And I don't know if you guys have talked about this, but I wonder if a Barnett and Finnemore approach could help the organization, or at least that theoretical framework could help the organization of these papers. And so you have the 99 International Organization article, and then the 2004 book, which really establishes the political independence and the power of supranational or international organizations independent from states. And it's rooted in a sense of bureaucratic control over information and the coordinating component that's really critical, I think, to both of these stories. And so I wonder if that could help provide some kind of theoretical anchoring for the expectations that guide the analysis. The third thing that I want to kind of encourage both papers to do is I'd like to see a little bit more intensive case analysis to illustrate kind of the logics or the arguments. You know, what are the expectations, and this is where it would help to differentiate. More intensive case analysis would help to, I think, differentiate from, say, some more state-centered alternative. And I'll give you some more examples of some of the questions that I have in mind as I work through the individual papers. The last thing I want to say for common, and I was talking about with Michael a little bit beforehand, I think both papers, even though there's a discussion of what is meant by catalyst, both papers could use a paragraph on that then guides your analysis. And specifically, and this could also set up the empirics, so when Michael was framing this to me in terms of a key role of, say, public goods provision by the institution, and so what, if the institution is a catalytic actor, what public goods should you see provided in your specific domains with respect to either crisis management or the diplomatic service? That could, so quick paragraph on this is how I interpret EU as a catalyst, and then this is what I expect to see given that function. All right, so let me talk more individually about the papers, and I'll start with Mai'a's paper. I like the structure of the paper, and I like how it's set up with 3 cases at the end. I think you cite a paper of yours on soft power. I think it would help to to get some sense of how that's shaping the analysis, to give a little bit more summary on what are the key theoretical claims in that paper and how it guides your analysis. I like, and this is going to bleed into another comment, this follows from you talk about fitting in the ideational space, or constructing an ideational space, and I like that example. So one of my questions I had before your presentation is how does the EEAS carve out the ideational space? And then you started to do that with an example in the counterterrorism case, and crossing these internal and external dimensions of how the problem is defined. So I see a policy effort there by people within the EEAS, but then the question is, what are the responses to this, and is it effective? And so if you can try to carve some, or provide some of that, that would really, I think, help strengthen the evidence there. I think there's a little bit of a tension in the paper from the first and the second halves about the role of relative soft and hard power. I think the front half of the paper is a little bit more skeptical that there's a lot of hard power, but then the back half with the cases, and particularly focusing on sanctions, is a real theoretical opportunity to illustrate the coordinating, and I'm guessing it's principally playing a coordinating role in setting up the sanctions. But I think that really elevates the importance of those cases in making the claim here that this is smart power, it's not just soft power, if that's the direction you want to go. So I also had a question, and you began to answer this in your comments. My question was, how much leverage does the EEAS have? How much political power does it have? And what happens if there are disagreements between the EEAS and member states? And so you mentioned at the beginning that there's actually a lot of consensus among states on this. And so one of my questions is, what happens if there's not consensus? And then what happens, is its leverage conditional on having consensus among member states? We talked about the ideational space. So one question that I have here, and I'm not sure whether it needs to be incorporated in the paper, but I wanted to know a little bit more about the politics of the EEA, about its creation, and I'm wondering if the bargaining associated with its creation shapes its subsequent effectiveness. And then the last thing that I would just question is, so I like the direction focus with the cases at the end, but I wonder, so part of my comments are geared towards getting more into the specifics of the cases, and so, but then you have this trade-off, right? If you get really into the specifics, then you can't cover all three, and so I might encourage you to look at one or two cases. I like the counterterrorism stuff to illustrate ideational, and then perhaps one of the second cases, because it allow you, one of the latter two cases, Iran or Russia, because talking about sanctions allows you to get at this hard power question. All right, so let me move to Chantal's paper. And many of my comments are going to be similar. Let me start with the kind of motivating question. And I wonder if you want to narrow that down a little bit. Right now I read the motivating question as an understanding how the crisis response system reflects the role of the EU in Europe's security and beyond. And I wonder if you want to narrow it down to something, say on the effect. So basically, is this an effective institution? And look at an example of that. Or is there an instance, this creation, something of more general, or can you use this institution to talk more generally about the impediments to cooperation on security matters within the EU? One of the things that struck me was this preference for ad hoc arrangements that you talk about. And so what are the theoretical implications of this choice? Does that reflect a broader difficulty associated with its coordinating role? Another kind of big question, or one area that I would push you at, is getting more into a specific case about how the crisis response group responds in a specific crisis. And so there's a little bit in Egypt here, and so I would encourage you to build on that or an alternative one. And I just think that getting into a case, it would be helpful to see, then you can point it, here's its coordinating role, these are some of the functions it's supposed to do, and then you can highlight impediments to that coordinating role. I also think the Egypt case would be nice because then you can see, given the coordination role, or a case more generally, you can see how this organization interacts with other organizations. So this is a background question. I don't think you need to spend a lot of time on this, and it's more kind of, it probably reflects my ignorance on the topic. You know, I'm wondering, as I was reading the front half here, what type of foreign policy actor is the EU? Is it solely about coordination and the sharing of information? Is this an informational role? What about the role of generating legitimacy? Is that why these agencies are created? What are its independent sources of power? So, and this is, like I said, these are just kind of background underlying questions I was curious about. Not necessarily need to really bring them into the paper, but I think answers to those questions kind of shape the analysis. We talked about the preference of ad hoc institutional arrangements. I think that's interesting, and that answers opens some good questions. I think the wrap up to the paper could use some kind of key lessons / theoretical implications that should be drawn from this case. Just a brief section. This goes back to right, the institution serving as a catalyst. And this is just kind of what I mentioned earlier. I'd really like to see, right, so what public goods, I can see in the crisis management group, institution, I can see the critical public good functions, which then implies something about the empirical evidence, but I'd like to see a list, right, of what public goods, how is it coordinating, who are its chief intermediaries. And then the last question here, and once again, this is kind of the big question, not necessarily need to be brought in here, but I was curious, so how does the crisis response group, how does it shape the content of a foreign policy response? So, right, you have questions about the effectiveness of coordination. Is there a feedback in here, right? So if this organization struggles or it doesn't get a good response from member states, how does it shape the content of the response? And that gets back to the larger, one of the theoretical questions that I pointed out to in terms of ascribing more independent agency to these organizations, right? Can we look at, right, some suboptimal outcomes here because it didn't have the capacities that it needed?
All right, thank you, Pat. And last but not least, let's hear from Bert Versmessen, who is from the EAS, so he's going to have a very particular and well-informed perspective on this.
I'll go there.
Oh, you'll do that? Okay.
Okay, well, thanks very much, first of all, for having invited me. First time I'm in Texas, and I should say, Lauren reminded me yesterday. I've stated disclaimer before I start that anything that I say can and may be used against me, but only against me. That's the point, not against the institution. I think when you are asked to comment about people who write about the stuff that you work on a daily basis, you have to approach that with a lot of humbleness to start with. For me personally, it has a great therapeutical value because I have a very frustrating job at times, getting member states to agree, getting different entities to work together. A British admiral once said it's like herding cats. That's what we're trying to do, and it's very, very difficult. So it has a therapeutical value, and I'm very grateful for that. Also, it's fundamentally unfair, of course, because you go and speak to people, and this is how I think it works, and then I get to stand up and say, no, that's not but I mean, first, I'll do the same structure, a bit like main points, and then comment on the paper specifically. There was a certain optimism around the papers, which again I found very therapeutical, as opposed to the gloomy Europeans that excel in self-flagellation. You have this sort of optimism. This thing is starting to work. A fragile balance, but a balance. Things like that. I mean, so typical of perhaps of the North American continent. It's also heretical at times. In one of the papers, I forgot which one, says that the EU is the only actor in the international system with capabilities similar to the US. No, that's, I mean, I think most people in Brussels would say, perhaps we should think again about that particular statement. And finally, very, very topical. So many of the points that are raised here, I mean, just, I look at my last week and then I look at this week once I'm back. I mean, the whole issue about security expertise and delegations following the Charlie Hebdo counter-terrorism. I was in the PSC on Friday, we were discussing that. We had a crisis platform on Ukraine last Friday, and when I go back, I go to a crisis platform on the Sahel region. And of course, I mean, the topic of the day again last Friday was, how can we help the OSCE that now has to monitor this Minsk, there's a whole debate on whether we call it Minsk 2 or not agreement. We were going to provide them with satellite imagery, analyze satellite. We were going to get some armored cars there. We had to sort of airlift them into the Ukraine. We had to have them repainted as well. We thought we'd stop by the Balkans just to get that done. And so, I mean, to just say, my point is here, this is all being very, very topical. Some general points. First of all, I mean, the title is European Foreign Policy, but perhaps it should be European Foreign Policy Actors. And my first impression was, you know, I mean, the emphasis is very much on who's doing what rather than on what are they doing. And I was afraid we had an academic spillover of all the institutional infighting that we do in Brussels and that we are very good at. But I think it's just a question about being precise about what the topic is. To a large extent, both articles are about what we call the comprehensive approach. And Mai'a seems to have come up with a actually new name for it, which is good, smart power. Perhaps we should start using that, because all these sort of, there's sort of fashionable element in these things as well. And I think comprehensive approach is going a little bit out of fashion, so perhaps we need a new term. But essentially it is about, we have all these instruments, sanctions, CSDP missions, development, humanitarian dialogues, etc., trade instruments. How do we mix them, how do we blend them? And then how do we sequence them? And that's very hard. And that's very hard at the EU level, but it's very hard at the national level as well, frankly. I don't know of well, I mean, who does that really well? Who does that really well? Mixing all these various elements and sequencing them properly. It's one of the most difficult things that there are. To a certain extent, the ES was created indeed to help that. And I mean, I was one of the first Belgian diplomats to be recruited in the US. I worked 3 months from my Belgian office. Still, it was all a bit chaotic in the end. I met a Dutch colleague 2 months into the creation of the ES and said, well, how are you? Well, my office is in that building, but when you ring me, it rings over there. That's funny, because my office is there, but when you phone me, it rings over there. But it was all a bit chaotic. And so when I see in one of the articles again, a quote of the Court of Auditors report, very critical of the EU reaction to the Haiti crisis in January 2010. Well, we were created in December 2010. So, I mean, there was a bit of a cheap shot, I would say. Captain used to say, all I got was a mobile phone and a list of phone numbers. And that's what I had to do the service with. That's the reality. But again, to come back to the main point, comprehensive approach, I think we were trying to fix a problem. The Lisbon Treaty is trying to fix a problem. Consistent or coherent foreign policy is like, you know, the Democratic Republic of. If you're really democratic, you don't put that in your name. You're trying to prove that you're being coherent, consistent. We had seen this growing disconnect, I would say, between the actions of member states, and that was a result of the pillar structure as well of the European Union, the huge financial flows that are associated with European development money, certainly if you add in the pooled money from member states, and some of the interests. I mean, interest used to be a dirty word almost, one that we could not use. I mean, parts of the House, and perhaps Lars will confirm this, think that we are an NGO. We are an NGO with a parliament, to make things even better. So the Lisbon Treaty introduced 2 innovations, and one of them was to make contributing to peace and international security an explicit objective of EU foreign policy. So, strangely enough, it was not up until then. One might wonder why. And secondly, yeah, to make this all work, we created EES, which is a source of different, mix of different sources, member states, diplomats, former council and commission officials, etc. So this is what we're trying to do. I think, blending all these things, get rid of the pillars, structure, and I would say that it's very much daily bread and butter. Now to be on the specifics on Mai'a's paper. By and large, I mean, I found a lot that I could agree with, really. I mean, the point about coherence, I think combining the hard and the soft power tools, at least again trying to do that. The consistency, I think in my earlier intervention I made the point about the fact that by having consistent interlocutors, that does help in your relations with not only with NATO but also with the UN and with other actors, and the fact that we are fundamentally a diplomatic actor. But perhaps with a little bit of caution is that, I mean, I talked about herding cats, which is quite hard, and it also depends on how many shepherds you have. We are not a big service. If you look at the numbers, but please do look at the numbers again. I think we're about the size of the Dutch Foreign Ministry, and certainly at headquarters, perhaps a little bit bigger. But the Auswärtiges Amt, the FCO, the Quai d'Orsay, all of these national diplomatic services are larger than we are, have more resources, have more experience. So it just, I mean, it does. You can't really compare us to the foreign service of a middle-sized state, with, I should add, 28 mothers-in-law. Because we do have 28 mothers-in-law that look at our fingers all the time. Regarding the choice of examples, well, I think there are three good examples. I would say that, again, this shows a little bit the optimism. Iran, the role that the ES plays, frankly, Solana already did it, so to what extent can you link it to the creation of the ES? And if you see what's going on now, there is a core bilateral component to this, which is Iran, US,
yes.
and that really is calling the shots at the end of the day. I don't think we may be, Mogherini may be the lead negotiator, but to a certain extent, I don't think she knows everything that's being said between Americans and Iranians. So, to what extent this is a very good example of US leadership, I don't know. Counterterrorism, again, the same. I think the international fight against counterterrorism is still very much led, again, by the United States. See the summit that we had in Washington last week. I had to say goodbye to my High Representative, who chaired only one session of a defense ministers meeting to come to Washington, where she was speaking at the high-level segment of the Counter-Violent Extremist Summit. So again, I think that is very much led by the United States. There are perhaps examples that we could look at where leadership has been far more visible. Thinking about the Balkans, for instance, where we do deploy a vast majority of all our tools, including the only tool where we have clear empirical evidence this is really working, which is the enlargement one. And we are shifting, take Bosnia for instance, from what people call a Dayton logic to a Brussels logic. Or again, the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, where again the High Representative has really played a key role in getting these two to talk to one another again. And no one else could have done that. It's just the EU, because of its power of attraction, the prospect of enlargement, the EU was the only one in a position to do that. Another crisis, which I think is interesting in terms of more of a leadership role, is the Horn of Africa and Somalia, where we do play again a leadership role, have deployed 3 CSDP operations, and are achieving some results in particularly then in the suppression of piracy. So I would take another hard good look in terms of producing examples for what you claim concrete examples, empirical evidence for what you claim, at the examples that you use. Then on Chantal's paper, I see this. I talked about the comprehensive approach, the mixing and the sequencing, and essentially the whole creation of this crisis response system was, an attempt to how do we fix that? How do we try to do that? And underlying it is a fundamental debate or question that we did not resolve. if we all have to be comprehensive, do we then give that to one service or not? I mean, if everybody has to be comprehensive, then why would you give it to one service and then everybody says, well, no, that's your, I mean, you have to do the comprehensiveness, not us. So I think that the choice was never really made. The question was perhaps never really asked as well. I would tend to more argue that it's everybody's problem and that while one does need robust coordination systems to attribute the responsibility to one service is perhaps not the best way forward. So I think, I mean, much of these points, which say the polycentric nature, the EU as an atypical security actor, I mean, again, all of these, and as an internal structure of power, again, are things I can very much agree with. But I would argue that this whole crisis response thing was a failed attempt, frankly, to instill more comprehensiveness into the system. And why did it fail? Well, I think first of all, what you pointed out in the paper, it was an unclear basis. Nobody was really clear about the mandate. I think the timing was perhaps also came a bit early. You have that's what you get with new stuff. You know, people are a bit wary. They're not so sure. They first want to see how it works. I think now that we are in the second high representative, that there is a lot more trust and confidence. Now we have a better atmospherics to make it work. The sheer complexity, let's be clear, I mean, I always pity those who have to teach European studies because, you know, it's very, very complex. It's a very complex environment. And I think, I mean, then perhaps and again you hint at this at the article, the sort of, you know, the culture of a foreign office is, I would say, is geared to crisis, but it's certainly not geared to a let's first act and then think approach. That does not work in foreign policy. It works for very simple crises like, okay, an earthquake, what do we need? We need search and rescue teams, we need to get them there fast, can we mobilize humanitarian aid, etc. That doesn't work for the more complex crises, and most crises that we see are very complex. So you do need a proper understanding of what's happening, what's the analysis, where do we want to go, and I think then you can start acting. And I think that's what's one of these, this overemphasis on early action was one of the reasons why perhaps this thing did not work out as planned. But we still have, I mean, we still have the challenge. You pointed out the crucial roles of crisis platforms, and we will certainly continue that. I'm quite optimistic that the cluster approach that Lars Erik referred to, which is basically you bring far more top-down the commissioners together to discuss issues, is actually going to produce better results in terms of EU foreign policy becoming more consistent. And there is, again, there's a crisis platform on, there is a commissioners group on Wednesday going to discuss partnership policy, migration, capacity building of third states, etc. So again, it's extremely topical, and we certainly have not given up on the objective of bringing all this together to increase our impact and increase our effectiveness. Well, I agree with that.
All right, thank you so much, Bert. All right, actually, let's open up to questions, and then you can respond. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
All right, so let's start with Lars Erik, and then.
Just a few short keywords from my side. On Mai'a's paper, I think you're into a very interesting area from my perspective. And I just want to mention to you 3 things which I would focus on if I were you. I would skip the Iran case. Simply because I just came from Iran. I was recently in Iran, and I agree very much with what Bert says. Now it's mainly a bilateral issue. It's not something which has been done as a mainstream activity of the ES. It's been done by very, very few people outside the normal organization, and essentially on behalf of the international community, not on behalf of the EU. On Russia, I've just written myself on Russia-Ukraine. I think there are many people working on that right now, and there's going to be a rather solid. But on terrorism, I both agree and disagree with Bert, because I've been involved in that for a rather great number of years, and I think there are 3 keywords there. First, total underestimation of what the EU does to counter terrorism. Total underestimation. Why? Because there is a very large number of actions and non-actions on the part of the EU which counter terrorism without being described as counter-terrorism measures. Because we didn't have the legal basis to do counter-terrorism in the community domain for a very long time. Now we may have a little bit more with the emergence of Justice Home Affairs system. We did a lot of things which actually countered terrorism and did not recruit and radicalize terrorists. Through our development policies, justice, rule of law, and all these things. Creating more cultural understanding, development policy, as you mentioned. I mean, there are a huge number of links that you can establish that effectively address many of the issues. When I'm reading, for instance, Secretary Gates or Secretary Panetta's memoirs, they are actually full of discussions of things that the EU did right and which they criticize the US for doing wrong, particularly on Iraq. You know, we broke up over Iraq in 2003, many on the criticism of the approach taken right after the fall of Saddam Hussein. And exactly, if you go back to Gates' memoirs, it picks up that, said, no, we should have kept the rule of law system intact, etc. We should have kept the civil administration. We should not have excluded the Sunnis, etc., and all these things which then created ISIS, as is now argued. So I think really you can, by combining what the underestimation due to the fact that we are dealing with a lot of implicit, non-explicit counterterrorism or radicalization, you can construct a very, very interesting case, which I truly believe would be a good example why you need this comprehensive approach. Now on Chantal's paper. The interviews I made, about 100 interviews in the last 3 years in the ES and the other services, great skepticism against Miotsi's department by almost everybody. Very low level of legitimacy. It was, many described it as sort of a fatigue on the part of Ashton, who wanted to get things done, you know, people out there, and she thought Miotsu would be a good person. Actually, there were some very good ideas brought into the system. It's actually Barnier's report from 2006, Jean-Marc Pisani who wrote that, who is now one of the heads of division. It's the RELEX crisis room, which was actually my baby for a while, with Andrea Ricci and others. There's some very good ideas, but it did not have the legitimacy. And then what I really pity is the fact that it was not integrated in the Argus system, which was created in the Commission, not for the Commission services. People mistake. It is the number of alert mechanisms with the member states that we have on civil protection, all of those are coordinated in the Argus system. And there are actually intergovernmental coordination systems on radiation protection, health security, and what have you, Ebola, and all these things. All of that is outside. And what you saw in the crisis platform figure that you mentioned here is only one place for the Commission people from all these different alert places. Whereas the Commission have also on their website a similar platform. So I really hope that this new cluster system will deal with this. I think Bert is right that we have a problem that needs to be still to be solved. We don't really, particularly if you want to do the internal external side of security at the same time, to get a great sense of ownership. Argus is not put up with anybody really in the lead. It's a Secretary General which is doing the coordination, but you don't have a specific service. It's a bit long, but I think this is very important thing to see that it's probably an experiment which didn't totally succeed.
Question? Okay.
Yes. In regards to counterterrorism and Dr. Mai'a and Dr. Chantal's proposals about security, and you have mentioned Libya 3 times, And as you may know, that in 2011, Libya had a no-fly zone done by NATO air forces. And at that time, during these 6 months, NATO has done 21,000 air mission striking Gaddafi's air forces. And at that time, according to the Libyan Prime Minister, Dr. Al-Kib, the first Prime Minister who led the first government after revolution, he said that we have received documents from the NATO evidencing that they let free entries for more than 2,000 terrorists entering the country from outside, specifically from Algeria, Tunisia, and Niger from the south, entering the country and forming groups, and they did not fight them while they were fighting Gaddafi's forces. My second point, at that time, 2011, in August specifically, the United States government released 2 prisoners, Guantanamo prisoners. One of them, his name Sofiane Bengamo, now is leading the largest pro-ISIS group in the city of Derna in Libya, in West Libya. Third point, the last point. That last week, in the United Nations meeting regarding fighting terrorism, there was, in the list that they have done in the countries to fight terrorism at, they did not include Libya. Libya is not included in the countries that needed to be fighting terrorism at. So I would like to hear your comments about, this proposal. Thanks.
All right, let's take a couple of responses, then we'll go for another round of questions. Mai'a, do you want to go first?
Okay, sure. Thank you very much for all of these comments. And just to start in order, I think Pat's comment about alternative explanations and theoretical grounding is really, really important. I do think, though, it should be in the framework article. I mean, because basically, as contributors, we're given the framework and then sort of said, I'm told to do the EEAS. And so if I were doing this totally on my own, the theory would be quite different. I think not necessarily contradictory, but just my own brain would come up with it, so it would be different. And so I think it would be helpful for us to talk further about that aspect so it grounds all of our empirical cases. And I like all of the suggestions Pat put forward about how to move forward with these case studies and particularly the ideational space and what are the responses, what happens within this ideational space. I think the cases are so contemporary that it's basically an evolving system right now, but certainly as we go forward there's more to be said. As far as the question about how much real leverage or political power does the EEAS really have, and isn't it just dependent on the member states? To a large extent, I would say yes, it's very, very dependent on member states agreeing before the EEAS can do anything. So the importance of Ashton, Mogherini, Solana is very clear because that person can try to bring member states together. But I think this answer also connects to your other question, which was about the creation of the EEAS, the sort of the bargaining that occurs at the foundation and how it sets the tone for it. And here I think the answer is quite positive in terms of the power of the EEAS, because in the foundation discussions, I felt that member states really showed their loyalty and sort of political will to make this thing work. Part of it is observable in the fact that regardless of whether the Constitutional Treaty or the Lisbon Treaty were approved, member states were adamant that they were going to launch this EEAS. So this was happening and this was something they really wanted. And then also when you look at populating the diplomatic service, member states were vying for the best capitals and sending their best ambassadors to the best capitals. So they're not just treating it as some sort of side project, they're really putting quite a bit of power into it and seeing it as something that they want. So overall, these things about the creation and then the growth of the EEAS on the part of member states, I think bodes well. I don't want to be just seen as sort of purely optimistic. I do see this as a practical matter. There are going to be different issues that we can't predict in the future where member states may not agree. But I think at least the way that they're approaching it, they didn't have to create it. They chose to create it regardless of the treaties. That this shows there is a political will for it to work. As far as this point that I have in the paper about the EU having similar capabilities to the US, yes, this is if you take it out of context, it sounds kind of strange. I'm seeing it this way. I'm taking this broader definition of security that we all acknowledge is the case. And I'm also thinking about, in the soft power literature, in particular Joseph Nye, he talks about kind of power and the international system being on 3 levels. If we're looking at military power, it's a unipolar system, the US is the one. If we're looking at economic relations, the system looks much more multipolar. US and EU are similar, there are BRICS and rising powers and so on. But if we look at the 3rd level where transnational actors are dominant, you've got terrorism and climate change and non-state transnational issues, the EU does start to approximate the abilities of the United States, and especially because it has this comprehensive approach, because it uses different forms and tools of power. At this level, the EU is a very viable actor in my view. As far as the case selection, this is really helpful. I mean, I think part of my question is sort of like, am I supposed to pick the cases where the EEAS is clearly dominant and the EU is therefore acting as the sole major diplomatic power? Or am I supposed to pick the most pressing issues of the time where the EU should be a diplomatic player? And if the EU falls short because the EEAS is not quite as involved like in Iran, then that's what I have to say. I have to say that the preferred outcomes or the role of the EEAS as a catalyst is not there, and this may vary across the cases. So, you know, I'm just not sure. I can see Iran being out, I can also see it being in, because Ashton, who is the former HRVP, has been in that role, so that is an EEAS connection. And counterterrorism, I'm really glad for that point as well. I think that, yeah, I can bring in many other aspects and linkages, and I'm appreciative of that point. I think it makes a lot of sense. For the Libya question, I don't know if it was directed at me, but I think this is basically, I mentioned it one time just simply to say that this is an example of where the EU doesn't agree. Here, NATO was important, and I think we can talk about Libya in our overall framework. Either as the EU being a catalyst but not being involved, or the EU encouraging member states to go forward, or some aspect of it. So I think it's interesting.
Again, thank you for the really interesting, relevant comments and question from the audience. Many good suggestions that I need to maybe take the time and see how I can restructure the paper. So maybe to be quick, I will focus on 2 points. Yes, about the idea to go in more details with specific case could be indeed really relevant to see how this crisis system response really work. And in the case of the Arab uprising in Egypt could be indeed the case with the League of Arab States, crisis room newly in place, being useful somehow to bring information to the EU. That's for sure, and that can also be, and then I will make the link with your comment about if at the end of the day the system finally change and is reorganized, but if at the end of the day at least the crisis platform remain because it somehow proved to be useful despite this ad hoc basis, to go in case study would be interesting, because when I conduct the interviews, what the people inside the department, the crisis response and operation department told me is that with the time they start to divide the normal crisis room with special crisis room for more long-term response and region, so to the Sahel and Horn of Africa. So they were kind of learning process, and the idea will be maybe to move from an ad hoc basis to a more regular, to follow up the evolution of the crisis, and to go also, I don't know if I really point out in my presentation, but for the moment is our level, our ranked official from the SOR are on the table, but there could be to organize crisis platform on a more regular basis, but where people not the director level, but among the team to make the information, the flow and information on a regular basis. So that could be also the option if I have in mind what you said about how to reframe my motivation question about how this experience, the use of this institution, what we have learned from that. And that will bring me also to a comment I want to make, and answering somehow the question with the comment you made about, in fact, for sure from the beginning, Muso was quite critical, or inside the EAS, its authority was challenged from early beginning. Also because, as you mentioned, this initiative from Barnier already in 2006 about this civil protection mechanism was there, and that's also the problem, is that already in the different EU institutions, other mechanisms are there in parallel. So about the future of the EU crisis response system will be also to think if there is a link between the existence, so the integrated political crisis response arrangement, which is in place, and the follow-up of the Madrid and London bomb attack was put in place and under the authority of the co-repair, so where more the member states are quickly involved. And also since 2013, this emergency response coordination center inside the Commission. So maybe an option would be to go and more and how to link those existing center. But for sure at the moment, indeed, we are more in the what lesson we can learn from this experience, and maybe it's something I can maybe add in the additional section you propose that I should ask as a warm-up part in my paper to see, okay, so that was the first trend. Maybe the timing was not there, maybe it was indeed early, but what we learned to bring maybe something more substantial in the analysis about maybe the next step on this topic.
Thank you. Just one quick point, because Mai'a very deftly threw the hot potato in my direction, so I got a good job. But I think Pat's point came up in a sort of different way when we presented this at ISA last week as well, where somebody basically asked us, well, what do we mean by the EU? Because in some of the papers, for instance, the past panel, we're thinking of the EU as sort of an organization that interacts with the OSCE or with NATO, and maybe is playing this sort of catalytic role in trying to get all these organizations to do sort of their parts, but for this to add up to something coherent, right? And what these two papers really talk about is a different view of the EU as an organization that's made up of a bunch of subparts that also need to be coordinated and catalyzed among themselves, right? So it's kind of it's an analysis at two different levels, right? And the problem is these are both true, right? So the EU does try to coordinate other organizations outside of it, but it also has to do a lot of internal coordination, right? So we're still trying to figure out how exactly to pack both of those levels into the same sort of project, but I think that we are aware that this is sort of an issue that we need to think about. And in terms of Libya, I mean, none of us are, as far as I know, experts on Libya, so I don't want to comment on the Libya part of it. But in terms of the sort of European Union involvement in it, or Europe's involvement, I think you can read the Libya case as either a case where the EU did perform a catalytic function, a coordinating function, or where it failed to do so. It sort of depends on how you interpret the evidence. Because if you think about it, the EU did play a role in sort of helping member states, namely France and the UK, launch these missions, also with NATO support, but then with the EU taking on some of the side projects, such as border security on land borders, and then also the maritime part of it, of the border protection in the Mediterranean. The EU took the lead on the sort of political front by being the first organization to recognize the new Libyan government, right, that emerged. And the EU did that actually before the member states did, interestingly, which is kind of a weird dynamic, right? So you can spin it that way. On the other hand, you can say, well, the EU didn't manage to get all of its member states on the same page, and therefore it failed to act as a catalyst. So I think it depends on what your expectations are. And I don't think that's a very sort of, I don't know, necessarily an answer that's very satisfying, which is actually why when we started this paper, the Libya case was the case study, and then we replaced it quickly with Ukraine, partially because that's what was really going on and in the minds of people, but partially because we thought it sort of fit better, because I think it's easier to say that the EU didn't do this right in Ukraine than to argue either that the EU totally failed in Libya or did it well. So it was a question.
Just on the catalyst issue, I think it fits perfectly, because if you look at almost all the alert mechanisms, including the intergovernmental systems we have in the EU, they are intended to catalyze and support member states and other international organizations like humanitarian and whatever to do their job. They're not supposed to do the job, they're supposed to to underpin, to facilitate, to coordinate, to harmonize, standardize, etc. And what you have in the EU, what is a problem, is increasingly the problem of multi-sector crisis, so that you have a number of different alert mechanisms being activated at the same time, and what do you do then? And then you need this coordination. But I also want to say, to underline the positive element in your continued work on the crisis issue. So I think that the platform notion is there and has been actually there. I started to work on the 1st of September 2000 in a directorate called the Crisis Platform in the Commission on External Relations. So it's actually been 15 years already. So it is a very viable system which will have to continue, will not disappear, as Bert said, I think.
Jan, and then Bert.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me briefly share two anecdotal stories from Egypt as I perceive it. First is on the External Action Service. 2011 in February, when the Egyptians brought down Hosni Mubarak, there was, 2 weeks later, roughly in Brussels, a meeting of EU heads of states and governments discussing how to respond to that. And they came to conclusion and they said, yeah, we need a unified European voice. David Cameron, who was part of this meeting, took his private plane, which was scheduled to head to Kuwait because he was on a state visit to Kuwait, and he redirected the plane, asked his pilot to stop over in Cairo, directly to discuss with the interim government, the SCAF, Supreme Council of the Egyptian Armed Forces, what the EU has decided and what to do next, and of course he discussed that from a very British perspective. Catherine Ashton, after the meeting in Brussels, apparently, that's what the high-ranking member of the British Embassy in Cairo told me, she went back to her office, asked her assistant to book a flight for her, because Catherine Ashton doesn't have a private plane, as David Cameron has. So that the assistant booked, I think, Lufthansa flight, Brussels, Frankfurt, Frankfurt, Cairo, and she arrived a day later. And then she spoke on behalf of the European Union, but the big business was already done by David Cameron the day before. And I think this is very telling about the cats that the EEAS has to take care of. It's not only to bring them together, also to keep them together after a decision has been taken. The second anecdotal story is, Chantal has very nicely explained the system of crisis groups around the world. And in Cairo I had the pleasure to be invited twice to visit the League of Arab States crisis room. And it sounds so fantastic, a crisis room. In fact, it's a room which is roughly half as big as this room. And there are some desks in it with computers on it, mostly run by students who are graduates from Cairo University, from my faculty. So I was very happy to meet them. But they are in the late 20s. And they have a huge video screen in front of them where they can switch from CNN News to Fox News to the different Arabic news channels. And they can also have a full computer screen, similar like here. And when I entered the room, I saw they used Microsoft Internet Explorer. And they had even Facebook open. So I wondered how effective is this crisis room if they use this daily technology that we could all use, and probably with Microsoft Internet Explorer, we are all a little bit careful when it comes to international security in terms of cyber security. What they do is they prepare daily analysis of crisis in the region. So they read online newspapers and they make a report that they send to all the League of Arab States member governments. The governments don't like this, because of course the Algerian government has a completely different perspective on the crisis in Libya than the Egyptian government. So what they do is they read it and they don't care about it because they have their own embassies networks. Even less so, and that's what I believe, I don't have the proof, but I believe if there's this connection between the League of Arab States crisis room and the crisis platform in Brussels somewhere, the EU member states care even less about the League of Arab States is saying in their analysis, because everybody knows that the League of Arab States is a bunch of nice people and they are very serious diplomats, but they have no power and no influence whatsoever. So I believe the German embassy in Cairo is much more important than the League of Arab States crisis room when it comes back to Berlin. The same for the French and the British and so on and so forth. So I think there's simply a doubling of structures, but the national relations is still more important. And that brings me to one important point when we speak about the topic seeking security. First, I think the title is a little bit problematic because this implies I seek for something that I don't have. Europe has security. Yeah. I'm not seeking for happiness because I'm unhappy, so I'm not seeking security. I have already security. It could be rather how to assure or how to increase security. That's the first point. The second point is connected to what Mai'a explained using the Charlie Hebdo attacks. I think the Charlie Hebdo attacks are a prime example to show how non-important external action is for fighting terrorism inside the European Union. The two brothers who killed the comics drawers and so were born in France, they were raised in France, they were imprisoned in France for certain crimes that they did. And finally they were radicalized in these prisons, according to all we know. They did not travel to Afghanistan, they did not travel to Syria. One of them apparently to Yemen, but I was in Yemen 3 times. So if it comes to this passenger name recording, yeah, I would be rather in prison now, because that's of course something which is completely, we use pump guns to shoot this sparrow. And I think that is a very final point for me, coming back to what we heard this morning, effectiveness. How to effectively secure security. And Sven Biskop made a nice remark in his presentation, yeah, a few dollars more. And then Raphael Biermann in his response said, yeah, we should discuss this question of how to assure effectiveness. And financial effectiveness is of course a huge part of it. And we spent billions of dollars, euros in Libya. And we spent billions of dollars in Afghanistan and other places, particularly in my area of expertise. What did we really achieve except wasting money? Because, and that's maybe just short answer, not comprehensive. Whatever the answer to Libya in 2011 was, to engage militarily or not, for sure this has triggered the crisis in Mali in 2012. Because we have somehow intervened in Libya, we have somehow created no-fly zones, which means all these insurgency fighters or terrorists or however they went back to Mali, they took all the weapons from Gaddafi with them to Mali, and we have the next crisis there. Then we intervened in Mali, the crisis moved to Central African Republic. So it's an endless story, and I have the impression the international military community, they are just running after the crisis. But the question indeed is, and that's really my last point, is seeking security, assuring security. We should also look into these non-military tools of improving security, and I think we heard already a lot of educational programs, exchange programs, and so on and so forth. So I want to stop here, but I think it's clear we should really see that we do not use pump guns to shoot sparrows, which are at the end the wrong means to fight them.
And just picking up on that, obviously the military is not the solution to all problems. It should be the last resort, and be thinking, one of the things we've learned is to be thinking about what happens next. After you've provided security, start planning for that even before you go in, if you can, if you've got that luxury, because it'll help you actually do that and set the situation so you can get yourself out safely. And that's obviously what didn't happen in Libya. Just my comment on the two papers, and it ties back to maybe helping the authors as you're putting it together. I think it'd be useful in both papers to then do the links to, in particular, the two other organizations, OSCE and NATO, both on External Action Service, and the example goes to Bert's one of the Western Balkans. And I think there's some good building on what the External Action Service has done, EU has done, and what NATO has done. And that's where the two organizations, I think, have done a good job working together, and even there, OSCE is in as part of that. So that might be one way to bring it in. And then on the crisis management, again, how does that fit? How does what EU is doing fit in with what NATO is doing, with what the OSCE is doing, and how the crisis management uses the OSCE to inform some of their decision-making, their situational awareness, if you will, and how the three, and that would then tie into the, how can the EU be a catalyst? How is it doing it now? How can it do it better?
Anybody else with a question? Yeah, let me turn it over to you guys again. Oh, yeah.
No, you mentioned money. I would make one important, I think, fundamental point there. Money, I don't think, is a big problem for the EU. What is a big problem, and where there is an enormous lack of political courage, is to say we don't have the staff we need. Clearly, the External Action Service does not have the thematic expertise it needs in order to liaise effectively with all the different areas of expertise. The only area of the External Action Service in the past which were able to ask for sufficient number of staff, I think, was the military staff. They simply refused not to start their work before they had the staffing calendar. But everyone else, from civilian crisis management and onwards, have been constantly understaffed since the fall of the Santer Commission. It's a really serious problem.
So let's just, except we go with Chantal first and then Mai'a second.
Maybe I will just go quickly on about how it fits yes with what NATO is. That's a good question, and also if we look the second diagram I show about the EU situation room with the link, when I conduct the interview, that's why I focus more on the regional organization. I get much more specific details because indeed, when come with the exchange of information with NATO, of course quickly the EU is facing some kind of competing interests or about if the information will pass at that level too, or if it stay at the inside NATO that the EU representative inside each member state inside NATO, so the member can have there the information. So I think it's, and we discussed it also last week at the exit, I mean the exchange of information is still, I mean, highly tricky, and maybe I can make the link also just the exchange of information among EU member states, the information that the member states accept to share with the EU situation room, it's already there problematic. So I cannot say that at this level the flow of information is really huge and that all information pass there. But when we think about the EU as a catalyst, I think to have already the structures there, the link, and that maybe we come to what we discussed this morning, a learning process that people develop this trust, know better each other. That's, I think, is all the question of trust. Also between those regional organizations, how they will accept to share their information with the time. So I think we come back to the question of trust, and then that will take time to really evaluate how useful this connection can be. But at the moment, it's still at the beginning, and what I understood is that people wait and see how the structures will evaluate before to maybe use it at the main channels of exchanging information. So maybe for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Just in listening to Jan's story about Egypt, I mean, I think all of these kind of Eurosceptic cases and stories are fascinating, and we can point to many of them. But at the same time, David Cameron's actions in your story are just absolutely typical of statesmen and politicians, right? They go and they bargain, they deliver ultimatums, they think about how it'll play out with the electorate. And this is why the professional diplomats in the EEAS are so crucial. I mean, most of my career, I've actually focused on internal diplomacy, the Committee of Permanent Representatives, EU ambassadors. And this is where you really see how, if we take a bigger picture, not just, 3 or 4 years, these European ambassadors are highly qualified and skilled at finding agreement that before was thought impossible. So the COREPER ambassadors were only given the mandate to prepare the meetings of the Council. Fast forward a few decades later, they're the de facto governing body of the Council. They're there every day and they make decisions. And in fact, the whole Justice and Home Affairs pillar arguably got merged into supranationalism because of COREPER. So when you see these kinds of trends in a bigger picture, I think there's hope for the EEAS. We're essentially turning diplomacy inside out. And that's why I look at it the way I do. I've seen these things internally. And then for the Charlie Hebdo attacks, yes, of course, terrorism is an internal issue. And if, as you say, these terrorists never left, that is certainly something that's important. But I think the points Lars Erik made earlier are relevant here, because the EEAS has this external dimension that complements the internal. And the external dimension involves all kinds of things like the development aid, the programs that stop radicalization, recruitment, and so on. I mean, there's just this huge number of areas that the EEAS is potentially involved in that has its counterpart. But I definitely see it as mainly an internal kind of issue. And yeah, I mean, the Western Balkans case, I will certainly consider bringing it in. I have to think carefully about case selection. I did make links to the OSCE and NATO, though, in the cases that I have. I think they're there, and the EU is a catalyst in that respect. And then finally, to Lars's point about the staffing problem, I think recruitment and training is key here. I think the EEAS needs some kind of European diplomatic academy that's more than the College of Europe to help resolve this and bring more people in.
All right, thank you. We're going to break for lunch, but if you have any other questions, please come in and ask your questions in private. And I want to thank our panelists once more. We meet back here at 2 p.m. for the final panel session, and then for the public event.
Reconvene at 2.
Do we have lunch or do we? Yeah. Okay. Is it?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much for.
Yeah, but let's do it.
Yes,